Prime Minister, Your Majesty.
Your Majesty, lovely to see you again.
Back again.
Oh, it's a great pleasure.
Yeah. Anyway.
Was Liz Truss the worst Prime Minister in British history? It's a tough competition. Historians have ranked Frederick North as one of Britain's most incompetent prime ministers for losing the American War of Independence. One could also name Neville Chamberlain for declaring peace for our time less than a year before Hitler invaded Poland. An honorable mention in this category might include Anthony Eden, who shattered the UK's standing as a dominant global power with his mishandling of the Suez Crisis. But in terms of public opinion, Liz Truss takes the cake as the least popular British Prime Minister ever since polling began. She might very well be one of the most unpopular politicians in UK history. A YouGov poll found that only 7% of respondents said she did well as Prime Minister. In recent years, there have been a few world leaders that have technically polled worse than Truss. These include the former president of France, François Hollande, and the once incarcerated former president of South Korea, Park Geun-hye. But at least those leaders managed to stay in power for a number of years. Liz Truss achieved the impossible by being universally hated within the entire United Kingdom in less than 2 months, making her the shortest-serving British Prime Minister ever. But there are always opportunities to learn from failure, and with Liz Truss, there's a lot to learn. Her premiership was the political equivalent of campy cult films like Ed Wood's Plan 9 from Outer Space or Tommy Wiseau's The Room. It's so bad, it's good. Just as film schools often examine these cult classics to learn how not to make a movie, Liz Truss presents a case study in how not to run a country. Anyone interested in ever running for office should look at all the major decisions she made and find success by doing the exact opposite. So let's have a look at the story of Liz Truss, the human hand grenade who destroyed the Conservative Party and the UK economy in just 45 days. Who was Liz Truss before she became Prime Minister? She was first elected MP in the 2010 general election, representing a safe Tory seat in rural southwest Norfolk. She may have been a Liberal Democrat and a vocal anti-monarchist during her youth at Oxford, but by the time Truss entered Parliament, she consistently represented the libertarian right wing of the Conservative Party. In her first year in Westminster, Liz Truss's priority was education, namely, to make universities more unaffordable for working people. Truss wrote in the Times that raising tuition fees are the best way to help the poor, and she would go on to vote for increasing the price cap for higher education from £3,290 to £9,000. A couple years later, she was promoted from backbencher to Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State of Education. Her first major policy proposal in this new role was a drastic cut to childcare. The plan didn't go anywhere, as it was considered too extreme for some of her Conservative peers. Even the Tory-friendly press slammed her by pointing out that Truss herself had a private nanny for her 2 daughters. Nonetheless, during these formative years, Liz Truss managed to cultivate a number of allies. With some of them, she co-founded the Free Enterprise Group, which described itself as the Free Market Caucus for the Conservative MPs. Truss and 4 other members of this faction summed up their ideology in a 2012 book titled Britannia Unchained, which was essentially a manifesto that advanced outdated trickle-down economics, or as they like to call it, supply-side economics. It is mostly a boring text, with the same old argument that cutting taxes for the wealthiest 1% will attract more investment and eventually, somehow, possibly, maybe, benefit everyone else in society. One key part of the manifesto raised eyebrows in the press, however. It was the argument that the UK had slow economic growth because the British are among the worst idlers in the world. We work among the lowest hours, they lamented. The average Singaporean works 2 hours and 20 minutes a day longer than the average Brit, as if longer work hours were to be so coveted. Yet, in spite of demonstrating blatant disdain for working people, or perhaps because of it, the Conservatives promoted Truss once again. And so, in 2014, she was made the Environment Secretary. the youngest ever female cabinet minister at age 38. In this position, she would gut the environmental agency and loosen regulations, resulting in a doubling of raw sewage discharge in England and Wales. Truss may have been a disaster for the ecosystem, but by faithfully doing the bidding of the elites, she became a rising star within the Conservative Party. However, not everything she did during this period proved to be as beneficial to her career as she would have liked. Surrounded for years by corporate hacks, Truss developed and even cultivated an insufferable habit of using corporate speak in her speeches. At a 2014 Tory conference, she delivered a bizarre talk on pork markets and cheese, which became somewhat of a viral meme, and she gave the media a field day.
We are growing wheat more competitively than the Canadian prairies. We're producing more varieties of cheese than the French. And we are selling tea to China. Yorkshire tea. When it comes to British food and drink, we have never had it so good. At the moment, we import 2/3 of all of our apples. We import 9/10 of all of our pears. We import 2/3 of our cheese. That is a disgrace.
It might be hard to believe now, but once upon a time, when she spoke in her natural voice, Liz Truss could actually be quite charismatic. But years serving as a corporate tool took its toll. Seduced by big business myths, she was keen to adopt its rhetorical style as well. In fact, not long before that pork and cheese speech, she admitted to have taken a course in corporate management presentational training. Even her closest friends thought it was a mistake. According to Christy Buchanan, Truss can be articulate, sharp, witty, funny, and engaging in private. But ever since undergoing training in corporate jargon, the young MP started to clamp up and, as Buchanan points out, this played into the worst elements of Liz's communication because it makes her more stilted. Now, Liz Truss's unrelatability, lack of charisma, and disdain for working people may have been a disaster in a general election, but her eventual path to the premiership didn't require a popular mandate. By the summer of 2022, all Truss needed to do to become Prime Minister was to win over other MPs and party members in the Conservative leadership election. It was in this rarefied setting, vying against 7 other upper-class Tory candidates, that Truss's corporate management presentational training paid off. By the time she faced the final runoff against Rishi Sunak, a former Goldman Sachs investor wealthier than Charles III, Truss could even downplay her elitist image.
It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister. And I've agreed with Sir
On July 7, 2022, after a series of scandals, Boris Johnson announced his resignation. This immediately triggered a Conservative leadership election, with the winner succeeding Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. Just 4 days later, Liz Truss declared her candidacy. At the onset, the bookies did not rank Truss as the favorite. Early polling among a field of 8 other candidates had her trailing behind 4 others. If it had been a simple first-past-the-post election with just 1 round of voting, she wouldn't have had a chance. But it was not a simple election. The process behind the leadership race had 2 phases. The first phase included multiple rounds in which only the Conservative MPs voted until the field could be narrowed down to just 2 candidates. And the second phase would be the final runoff, with the full Conservative Party membership choosing from the last 2 remaining candidates. Therefore, all Truss had to do was to simply remain in contention and not be disqualified during the first phase of the MP votes, and she would then hope to win the final runoff by being perceived as the least worst candidate of the remaining 2. Liz Truss had a rough start to her campaign as she was, once again, made aware of her stiff, unrelatable style of communicating. After her first debate, a fellow Conservative MP, Richard Drax, texted Truss, "Having spent many years on TV, can I please give you some tips? You are too wooden. No humanity there. Drop the shoulders, slow the voice, and smile." Drax's unsolicited advice was equally unwelcome. Wounded by criticism, Truss spent less time looking at her phone. One of her closest allies, Therese Coffey, went berserk in her defense with the threat to stab Drax with a stiletto. Meanwhile, Liz Truss's other allies started to bring their knives out, launching calculated and vicious attacks against her enemies, all the while making sure that the candidate herself kept her hands clean. One of the most pitiless attacks committed by Team Truss came against Penny Mordaunt, one of the frontrunners during the early rounds of voting. Mordaunt was initially vague enough on various hot-button issues that she was able to win over both the right and moderate wings of the party. But that all changed when one of Liz Truss's supporters leaked an old policy paper to the press, revealing that Mordaunt was in favor of removing certain medical requirements for people to identify as transgender. She tried to deny it but was called a liar during a televised debate, and Mordaunt began to lose support from the right wing. And without Truss herself going for the killing blow, another candidate, Suella Braverman, said Mordaunt was too woke to be Prime Minister. But these were not the only dirty tricks from Team Truss. Another effective strategy was to curry favor with candidates who failed to make the runoff, inveigling them with promises of cabinet posts. When Suella Braverman lost in the second round, Truss's campaign offered her the position of Home Secretary in exchange for her support. Braverman went for it and brought her shares of MPs to Truss's camp. When Tom Tugendhat was eliminated in the third round, he was also pitched the high-level position of Minister of State for Security, a post he would eventually hold in Truss's short-lived government. And despite having been sabotaged by Team Truss, even Penny Mordaunt would throw her support, and she would eventually be rewarded as the leader of the House of Commons. As we will see, these tenuous alliances that brought Truss to the premiership would prove to be unreliable. These losing candidates had no genuine love for the Norfolk MP, and they would wait for the opportunity to get their political revenge. Braverman would be one of the first ones to jump ship once Liz Truss started to sink, and in the end, Mordaunt would also have the last laugh.
Let's be clear, we have inflation because of our monetary policy, that we haven't been tough enough on the monetary supply. That's the way I would address that issue,
Okay.
But it is wrong.
Interest rates up, mortgages nightmare.
It is.
Liz, we have to be honest. We
I'm
have
being
to be
honest.
honest. But borrowing your way out of inflation isn't a plan, it's a fairy tale.
After a messy week of backstabbing and palm greasing, Liz Truss squeaked through to the final runoff, in which she faced Rishi Sunak. By then, Truss's pathway to victory was smooth. The first polls for the runoff showed Truss at 62% and Sunak at 38%. On paper, Sunak should have been the favorite. Throughout the preliminary rounds, he had won a larger share of the MP vote. Another plus was his previous support for Brexit, which Truss had campaigned against. But Truss had two key advantages against her opponent for the final runoff. First, while Liz Truss was known as an elitist, her reputation was nothing compared to Sunak's. During the campaign, a video of a 21-year-old Sunak resurfaced in which he avowed having aristocratic friends and none who were working class.
Friends who are aristocrats, I have friends who are upper class, I have friends who are, working class, but I'm not working class, but I mix and match and then I go to see.
In a sense, this was an unfair gotcha, given that it was an old video, but it reinforced what the public was already thinking about Sunak, who had a net worth of $810 million. This kind of wealth was not a liability during the first phase of the leadership election. In fact, many fellow upper-class conservative MPs no doubt viewed it as a mark of success and an accomplishment. But once Sunak reached the stage when voting would be among the conservative membership at large, the wealth and the upper-class associations made him look out of touch, and Truss gladly exploited this evolving perception. In one of their earlier debates in the leadership election, Sunak tried to score points by reminding the audience that Truss had once been a Liberal Democrat and had opposed Brexit. In a textbook illustration of a loaded question, he asked her which one she regretted most. Truss managed to return the jibe and even overcame her own patina of corporate imprimatur by pointing out the privilege Sunak was born
I
into.
was just wondering which one you regretted most.
I am somebody who was not born into the Conservative Party. My parents were left-wing activists, and I've been on a political journey ever since. But my fundamental belief, and the reason I am a Conservative, is I saw kids at my school being let down in Leeds. I saw them not get the opportunities, not get the proper educational standards that you might have got at your school, Rishi.
In one fell swoop, Truss was able to highlight her own personal growth, while at the same time, portraying Sunak as an out-of-touch aristocrat. Aside from their personal histories, Truss's bold position on taxes also gave her a decisive advantage. Basically, Truss gave the Conservative membership what they wanted to hear, that she would cut taxes across the board. She promised a government that puts more money in your pocket, and she gave simple answers and solutions that ordinary Tory members could easily understand. Sunak, on the other hand, made the mistake of being honest. To his credit, he cautioned against the massive tax cut, arguing correctly that it would only exacerbate the double-digit inflation the UK was already facing. Sunak understood that tax cut would increase the number of pounds in circulation, encourage more spending, and thereby drive up prices. He was basically preaching basic economic principles of supply and demand. As Sunak said in one interview,
If you borrow tens of billions of pounds, pump that money into an economy, then that fuels inflation and that pushes up interest rates even higher. And that's what I'm trying to avoid. Now, of course, Andrew, look, listen, it would be the easiest thing in the world for me to sit here and say, no, I don't want to do any of these difficult things. I'd like to give everybody all these nice things. Don't you think that would make my life easier? It's because I genuinely believe it would not be the responsible thing to do.
As I said, Sunak was making a mistake by assuming the Conservative membership had this basic understanding of economic principles. They did not, and they were easily enticed by Truss's rosier promises that all Britain needed to solve its economic woes was a massive tax cut. In the end, Truss found lots of buyers for the snake oil she was selling. Her easy answers won the day. Truss beat Sunak in the final runoff with 57% of the membership vote. When she entered number 10 Downing Street, pundits and historians were already calling her predecessor, Boris Johnson, the worst prime minister in recent years. Surely, it was going to be an easy act to follow. I mean, how much worse could Liz be? On September 6, 2022, Liz Truss gave her first speech as Prime Minister in front of her new accommodations. Referring to the country's inflation crisis, she confidently vowed that the country would ride out the storm. Perhaps her metaphor had been drawn from the sudden heavy rainfall that had caused the delay in the start of her 4-minute address. In any case, it nicely punctuated her promise to grow the economy through tax cuts and reform. 2 days later, on September 8th, Truss announced her first big policy proposal as Prime Minister, the Energy Price Guarantee. The plan was to cap the average household energy bills to £2,500 for over 2 years. The £120 billion price tag for the government seems out of keeping with Truss's pledge, and behind the scenes, she was not at all enthusiastic about the proposal. It required a lot of effort for Truss's advisors to convince the new Prime Minister that this was a policy she had to pass. As one Conservative MP put it, the whole thing was completely alien to her worldview. Breaking with her conventional free market philosophy, Truss eventually agreed, but she reassessed her libertarian values by telling her advisors that she only wanted to have to do this once. The announcement of the energy price guarantee was supposed to dominate the news for weeks, and if it had received all the expected attention, the general public might possibly have warmed up to Liz Truss. But the timing did not work out. Just hours after she introduced her first major policy proposal as Prime Minister, another Liz would steal all the headlines. On September 8th, Queen Elizabeth II passed away. Politics and virtually everything else took a hiatus with a national 10-day mourning period. But in the following weeks after Britain mourned the death of its longest-serving monarch, the woman who would eventually be the shortest-serving Prime Minister would quickly redirect the spotlight onto the political stage. September started with a tragedy, but ended with a farce. As Truss herself once remarked, "Drama just seems to follow me wherever I go." On September 23rd, 2022, Liz Truss's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, introduced the infamous mini-budget, with the largest tax cut in 50 years. Although it technically cut taxes for the middle class as well, it was mostly aimed at benefiting the top 1%. The budget's most extreme measures included the freeze of corporation tax at 19% and an abolishment of the 45% top rate of income tax.
But I'm not going to cut the additional rate of tax today, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to abolish it altogether. From April the 23rd, we will have the highest...
While the energy price guarantee was a policy Truss had to do, a massive tax cut for the rich was what she always wanted to do. Unlike the plan for the energy cap, which came from her advisors, the mini-budget was conjured up almost entirely by Truss and the Britannia Unchained co-author Kwasi Kwarteng. Of course, everyone had anticipated a tax break, but almost no one expected it to be as extreme as it was. It was more than what had been promised during the Conservative leadership election. Even Truss's allies were surprised by the scale of the tax cuts. One senior advisor only realized their extent while watching the speech live on TV, and news that they would abolish the top rate of income tax caused at least one Conservative MP to shout "Jesus Christ" from the public gallery. Truss didn't even share her plans with her own communications team, who watched in shock like everyone else. "Why the f*** are we doing this?" one aide reported to have said. The new Prime Minister may have succeeded in bringing a bit of excitement back to politics, but she soon learned that the more substantial ramifications would not be what she expected. Immediately after the announcement of the mini-budget, the economy went into a downward spiral. At a time when the UK was already suffering double-digit inflation, the value of the pound nosedived to its lowest level on record, just when the country needed more purchasing power. The international markets dumped the sterling for safer currency such as the US dollar. This led to a crash in the UK bond market, and British pension funds, which held bonds as assets, were brought to the brink of collapse, only to be saved by an unprecedented intervention by the Bank of England. From there, the show continued. A week after the mini-budget, the Labour Party saw a jump in its polling to give it a 33-point lead over the Tories. According to one YouGov poll, if an election had been held during that period, the Conservative Party would have lost 362 seats and won a total of just 3. When Truss tried to explain herself to the public, her corporate speak made her sound completely unsympathetic. Working-class British people were worried about their pensions and mortgages, and the best their Prime Minister could give them was a half-assed apology phrased in an ever-infuriating passive voice.
I do want to accept responsibility and say sorry for the mistakes that have been made.
Truss tried to make a series of U-turns, backtracking on the freeze on corporation taxes and an abolishment of the top rate of income tax. While markets calmed for a brief moment, confidence in the UK economy couldn't be restored so long as she was still Prime Minister. When it became clear to everyone that the end was inevitable, the killing blow came from her old rivals. Her Home Secretary Suella Braverman resigned with a scathing resignation letter that went public. And still stinging from the leaked transgender policy paper that had sunk her own chances of becoming Prime Minister, Penny Mordaunt finally got her revenge in a subtle yet brilliant denunciation.
And all we know right now is, unless she tells us otherwise, that the Prime Minister is cowering under her desk and asking for it all to go away. Isn't it about time she did and let somebody else who can make decisions in the British national interest get in charge instead?
Well, the Prime Minister is not under a desk, as the Honourable Lady. I can assure the House.
On October 20th, 2022, just 45 days since she started, Liz Truss announced her resignation. So, what can we learn from the Liz Truss saga? As I said earlier, there are always ways to learn from failure. But in the case of Truss's premiership, I've narrowed down to just 3 key takeaways. The first lesson is a simple one. Politicians should not make tenuous alliances with rivals whom they have previously sabotaged. Backstabbing and bribery can get you ahead in politics, but no one should attempt to do both to the same person. Politicians tend to be more petty than normal people, and the real ambitious ones like Suella Braverman and Penny Mordaunt are not going to let go of a grudge. The second lesson is that politicians should ditch the corporate jargon. It may work for some, but most people do not want to vote for someone groomed by a marketing agency. Most people generally respect sincerity and even the occasional display of vulnerability. Truss should have known this quite well. During her first run for Parliament in 2010, she faced a potentially devastating scandal when it was revealed that she had an extramarital affair with a sitting MP named Mark Field. At first, the scandal seemed like it would derail Truss as the Conservative candidate. But after a candid speech, in which she cried before the audience, Truss regained voter support. She showed vulnerability, and it helped her secure a seat in Parliament. But that more relatable Liz Truss was long gone by the time she became Prime Minister. It was replaced by a heartless-sounding propagandist for corporate interests. Finally, the third lesson is perhaps the most obvious one. Trickle-down economics is dead, and policies that are built on this theory are doomed. Liz Truss's signature policy was based on the idea that tax cuts for the wealthy would benefit everyone. But these days, almost no one really believes that massive tax cuts for the wealthy will stimulate the economy. This is no longer the era of Margaret Thatcher, and people no longer fall for the idea that the best way to help the working class is to let the rich get richer, not the voters, and not even the elites. Brits are sick and tired of the same old lie. Since 1979, when Thatcher became Prime Minister, incomes for the top 1% of earners tripled while those at the bottom 20% rose by just 6%. Time after time, tax cuts were given to the wealthy and they did nothing to improve the lives of everyone else. And both the working class and middle class are well aware of this. Even rich investors know that the promises behind trickle-down economics are just lies. They should know more than anyone else. It is not like corporate elites spend most of their money after receiving a large tax break on investing in small businesses. These days, they just make most of their money on speculating in the derivatives market or on stock buybacks to inflate the value of their own shares. How would any of this trickle down? But the modern Conservative Party is now what even investors have called a doomsday cult for being so committed to a long discredited ideology. The Tories have not even learned their lesson from the disastrous mini-budget. As revealed just recently, Liz Truss is actually not sorry and was never sorry. On September 18th, 2023, in her first major speech since the end of her premiership, Truss doubled down. She had the audacity not only to defend her short stint as Prime Minister, but to argue that the country needed even more tax breaks. And according to her, the collapse of the pound and the bond market during her tenure was everyone's fault except her own. In a stunning distortion of causes and effects, she argued that tax breaks were in fact the right thing to do and that the quote-unquote reaction from the quote-unquote political and economic establishment was what crashed the economy. For the Labour Party, Liz Truss is a gift that keeps on giving. It would not even be far-fetched to imagine that Truss is in fact an agent provocateur who never really moved away from her left-wing, anti-monarchist past. So bad it's good for the opposition. Truss may have dedicated her whole political career to destroying the Conservative Party from the inside. I might have ended this episode by putting on a tinfoil hat, but it is still too difficult for me to believe that Liz Truss could be this crazy.